On the morning of August 22, 2005, a woman named Stacey Castor picked up the phone in her home in Clay, New York, and called 911. Her voice was small, frightened, the voice of a wife who had spent the last 24 hours pacing outside a locked bedroom door, growing more and more certain that something terrible had happened. On the other side of it, she told the dispatcher that her husband, David, had locked himself in their room after an argument the day before, that he had been depressed since his father died, that he wasn't answering his phone, that she was scared. The sergeant who arrived at the house kicked the bedroom door open with the side of his boot, and inside that room, on that bed, he found a man who had been dead for hours. Beside David Castor's body, on the nightstand, were two objects that would define the next 4 years of an investigation. The first was a glass, half full of a bright, almost luminous green liquid. The second was a plastic container of automotive antifreeze. The cap unscrewed, the label facing the wall. To the responding officers, it looked like one of the saddest and most ordinary kinds of death a small-town sheriff sees in a career. A grieving man, a bottle of poison, a locked door, a wife crying in the hallway. The sergeant on scene told reporters that day that it appeared to be a simple suicide by antifreeze poisoning. Simple, that was the word he used. He did not know yet that there was nothing simple about anything that had happened inside that house. Before we go any further into this story, before we deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what you are about to hear is not the story of a woman who killed her husband. It is the story of a woman who killed her husband, and then, when investigators started asking questions she could not answer, made a decision so cold, so calculated, so unthinkable, that the district attorney who prosecuted her would later say that in his entire career he had never seen anything like it. She decided to kill her own daughter, her 20-year-old daughter, the girl she had raised alone after her first husband died, suddenly, of what doctors at the time called a heart attack. The girl who called her mother her best friend, what the detectives in Onondaga County did not know on that August morning in 2005 was that they were looking at the second body. 5 years earlier, in the year 2000, Stacey's first husband, a man named Michael Wallace, had also died in his bed. He was 38 years old. He had 2 young daughters. He had been sick for weeks. The doctors who examined him ruled the death a heart attack, signed the certificate, closed the file, and Stacey Wallace, as she was then known, collected the insurance, buried her husband, and within 3 years had remarried a quiet, hard-working man named David Castor, a man who built things with his hands, a man who, on the day he stood at the altar and slid a ring onto Stacey's finger, had no possible way of knowing that the woman smiling back at him had already done this once before, and was already, in the back of her mind, beginning to plan how she would do it again. What you are about to see is the story of how she almost got away with it, how she might have walked free, collected a second life insurance payout, buried a second husband under a second false cause of death, and started looking for a third. How a single misspelled word, written in a suicide note that was not actually a suicide note, and did 2 years of careful, patient, cold-blooded planning. How a 20-year-old girl, lying in a hospital bed with enough vodka and prescription pills in her system to kill 3 grown men, woke up just long enough to tell a detective the one thing her mother had not counted on her surviving to say, and how a county prosecutor, looking at a glass of green liquid in a crime scene photograph, finally asked the question that no one had thought to ask in 5 years, the question that should have been asked the very first time a man died in Stacey Castor's bed, the question that, when it was finally asked, opened a grave in the cemetery in Cayuga County and pulled a body out of the ground that had been buried and forgotten for 7 years. This is the case of Stacey Castor, the woman the press would come to call the Black Widow of Central New York. And before this story is over, you will understand why the judge who sentenced her, a man who had spent -4 years in courtrooms, watching serial killers and contract killers and killers of every kind walk past him in chains, looked her in the eye on the day of her sentencing and told her, in front of her surviving daughter, in front of the family of the man she had murdered, in front of every reporter and camera in the room, that she was in a class all by herself. But to understand how a woman like Stacey Castor was able to kill 2 men, almost kill her own child, and walk into a courtroom in 2009 still believing She was going to walk back out. You have to go back. Back before the antifreeze. Back before the locked bedroom door. Back to the very beginning. Back to a young woman named Stacey Daniels, growing up in a small town in upstate New York, who, by every account of every person who knew her then, seemed, on the surface, to be entirely ordinary. Stacey Ruth Daniels was born on July 24, 1967, in the small town of Clay, in Onondaga County, New York. Her parents were Jerry Daniels and Judy Eden, working-class people from a part of the country where most families knew each other. Most jobs were within 20 miles of where you grew up, and most lives followed a quiet, predictable arc from childhood to marriage, to children to retirement, to the cemetery on the edge of town, by every account of every neighbor and former classmate who would later be asked about her. Stacey was an ordinary girl, polite, pretty, not the smartest student in her class, not the dumbest. She liked to laugh. She liked attention. She had a way of making whoever she was talking to feel, in that moment, like the most important person in the room. It was a quality that would, much later, save her from suspicion for far longer than it ever should have. She met Michael Wallace when she was barely out of high school. He was a heating and air conditioning technician, a steady young man with calloused hands and a quiet manner, the kind of small-town boy who other small-town boys called dependable. They married in 1988, when Stacey was 21 years old. Within a few years, they had 2 daughters. The older girl they named Ashley, the younger they named Bree. To everyone who knew them, the Wallaces looked like exactly the kind of young American family that the small towns of central New York had been producing for generations. A husband who worked with his hands, a wife who managed the house, 2 little girls in matching dresses at Easter and birthday parties on the back lawn. There was no one, in those early years, who looked at Stacey Wallace and saw anything other than what she appeared to be: a wife, a mother, an ordinary woman, living an ordinary life, in an ordinary town, but somewhere underneath that ordinary life, in a place where no neighbor and no friend and no family member could see it, something in Stacey Wallace had begun to come loose. Whether it had always been there, whether it had grown out of the quiet boredom of those years, whether it was triggered by a specific event that no one would ever identify, the people who would later try to understand her could never quite agree. What they would agree on, eventually, was that by the time Michael Wallace turned 38 years old, in the winter of 1999, his wife had already begun the long, patient work of killing him. He just did not know it yet. No one did. And by the time anyone in central New York thought to ask the question, Michael Wallace would have been in the ground for 7 years. Michael Wallace began feeling sick in December of 1999. It started small, a flu that would not go away, stomach pain, a creeping fatigue that made it hard to climb the stairs at the end of a long day on the job. He went to the doctor more than once. They ran tests. Nothing came back. They told him it was probably a virus. They told him to rest. They told him to drink fluids. They sent him home, again and again, to the wife who was waiting for him with a glass of something warm, something to settle his stomach, something that, she said, would help him feel better. By the middle of January in the year 2000, Michael Wallace was a man visibly disappearing inside his own body. He had lost weight. His skin had taken on a strange color. His own brother, when he saw him at a family gathering, would later tell investigators that Michael had looked, in those final weeks, like a man who was being slowly erased. On the night of January 22, 2000, Stacey called for an ambulance. She told the paramedics her husband had collapsed in their home. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, Michael Wallace was gone. He was 38 years old. He left behind 2 daughters, the older one 11, the younger one 9. The doctors who examined the body found a man whose organs had -1 in ways that were consistent, broadly speaking, with cardiac arrest. There was no autopsy ordered. There was no toxicology screen. There was no investigation. Why would there have been? A young father had died suddenly at home. His grieving widow had called for help the moment it happened. The death certificate was signed. The cause of death was recorded as a heart attack. Michael Wallace was buried in a cemetery in Cayuga County, New York, in the cold ground of an upstate January, beside the headstones of his own grandparents. And his wife collected the life insurance. What no one understood at the time, what no one would understand for another 7 years, was that the warm drinks Stacey had been bringing her husband during those final weeks of his life had not been helping him at all. They had been killing him. She had been mixing ethylene glycol the toxic chemical found in ordinary automotive antifreeze, into his food and into his beverages, in doses small enough that no single drink would cause him to collapse, but cumulative enough that, over the course of weeks, his kidneys and his liver, and his brain had been quietly poisoned, beyond any hope of recovery. Ethylene glycol is, in many ways, the perfect poison. It is sweet. It is easy to disguise in coffee, in juice, in soup. It is widely available, sold in every auto parts store and every gas station in the country, without a license or a record of purchase. And in its early stages, the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning look almost exactly like the symptoms of the flu. Stacey Wallace, the polite young woman from Clay, New York, had figured out something that very few murderers ever figure out. She had figured out how to kill a man in a way that looked, to every doctor and every coroner who examined him, like nothing at all. For 3 years after Michael's death, Stacey lived as a widow. She raised her 2 daughters. She worked as an office manager at a local company. She told everyone who asked about her late husband the same story. He had gotten sick. The doctors could not figure out what was wrong. He had died young. It had been the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And then, in 2003, she met David Castor. David was a contractor, a man who built and repaired homes for a living. He was 46 years old when he met Stacey. He had been married before. He had a son from his first marriage, also named David. He was not a wealthy man, but he owned his business. He owned his truck. He owned his home. And he had spent his whole working life accumulating, quietly and without fanfare, the kind of small-town American security that does not look like much from the outside but represents 30 years of disciplined labor on the inside. They married in 2003. By every account of every person who knew David Castor, he loved his new wife. He treated her 2 daughters as if they were his own. He moved Stacey and the girls into his home. He put her name on the deed. He named her in his will. He was, in the language of small-town America, a good man who had finally caught a good break. He had no way of knowing that the woman he had married had already, by the time he slid the ring onto her finger, decided how his marriage was going to end. He had no way of knowing that everything she had done with Michael Wallace, every meal and every drink and every patient, methodical dose of green liquid in a coffee cup, she was preparing to do again. The only difference, this time, was that David Castor was a larger man, and a healthier man, and a more careful man than her first husband had been, and so it would take her longer. It would take her almost a full years. By the summer of 2005, David Castor was a man visibly unwell. He had been complaining of headaches, stomach pain, a fatigue he could not shake. He had been to the doctor. The doctor had told him, much as Michael Wallace's doctor had told Michael 5 years earlier, that it was probably stress, probably a virus, probably nothing. David's friends and his co-workers and his son would all later say the same thing. He had not been himself for months. He had been losing weight. He had been moving slowly. He had been, in the words of one of the men who worked for him, a man who looked like he was carrying something he could not put down. On the night of August 20th, 2005, David Castor went into his bedroom and closed the door. According to his wife, the 2 of them had argued. According to his wife, he had been depressed. According to his wife, she had not seen him or heard from him in the 24 hours that followed. And on the morning of August 22nd, when the sergeant from the Onondaga County Sheriff's office kicked open the bedroom door, David Castor was dead in his bed, with a glass of green liquid on the nightstand beside him, and a bottle of antifreeze with the cap unscrewed, the label turned toward the wall. For most of the men and women who responded to the scene at the Castor home that August morning, the case appeared to close itself within the first hour. A grieving husband, a locked door, a bottle of poison, a wife in tears. The sergeant on scene, a veteran officer named Michael Norton, told the reporters who gathered outside the house that day that it appeared to be a simple suicide by antifreeze poisoning. But 2 things, almost immediately, began to trouble the investigators who looked closer. The first was that David Castor's ex-wife, who had remained on good terms with him after their divorce, was adamant that David Castor was not the kind of man who would ever take his own life. He had been a steady, optimistic, hard-working man. He had been planning future projects. He had been talking, just weeks before his death, about expanding his contracting business. He had not been depressed. He had not been suicidal. He had not, in her words, been anything close to a man who would lock himself in a bedroom and drink a glass of antifreeze. The second thing that troubled the investigators was the crime scene itself. There was something staged about it. The bottle of antifreeze had been set down too neatly, the glass had been positioned too carefully on the nightstand, and the medical examination of David Castor's body, when it came back, did not match the story Stacey had told the police. David had not died after a single, despairing swallow of poison in a locked room. He had been dying for weeks. The ethylene glycol in his system had been administered in doses, over time, in the same slow, patient, methodical way that someone had once administered it to a man named Michael Wallace, in a different house, in a different county, 5 years earlier. By the time the detectives in Onondaga County made that connection, by the time they began to wonder out loud whether David Castor's wife had ever been married before, by the time someone made the phone call to Cayuga County and asked the question that had not been asked in 7 years, Stacey Castor had already filed her late husband's will. A will, it would later be proven in court, that she had forged, a will that left her everything. In September of 2007, 2 years after David Castor's death, investigators did something that almost no investigators ever do. They went, in secret, to a cemetery in Cayuga County, and they exhumed the body of a man who had been buried for 7 years. They did it at night. They did not tell Stacey Castor. They did not tell anyone in her family. They brought Michael Wallace's coffin up out of the cold ground, transported it by ambulance to the medical examiner, and they ran every test on what remained of him that they had not run, that no one had ever thought to run. In the winter of the year 2000, and when the results came back, the medical examiner found in Michael Wallace's tissues the same chemical, in the same patterns, that had killed David Castor 5 years later. A heart attack had not killed Michael Wallace. His wife had killed him. And now, finally, after 7 years, the state of New York knew it. The detectives knew. When they began to close in on Stacey Castor in the late summer of 2007, that they had a problem. They could prove, scientifically, that both of Stacey's husbands had died of ethylene glycol poisoning. They could prove that she had been the one with access. They could prove that she had collected the insurance and the inheritance from both deaths. But proving that she had personally administered the poison, that she had stood in her own kitchen and mixed the antifreeze into her husband's drinks with her own hands, was a far harder thing to prove in a courtroom. And so the detectives did something that they would later say they wished, for the rest of their careers, they had not been forced to do. They went to Stacey's daughter. They went to Ashley Wallace, the older girl, the one whose father had died when she was 11 years old, the one who, by every account, had grown up calling her mother her best friend. And on the first day of Ashley Wallace's college orientation, in September of 2007, a detective named Dominic Spinelli sat her down and told her that her father had been murdered. Ashley did what any 20-year-old girl would have done. She called her mother. She told Stacey what the detective had said. She asked her mother what to do. And Stacey, the woman Ashley had trusted her entire life, the woman who had raised her after her father died, the woman who had told her again and again that she was her best friend, told Ashley to come home, to come to the house in Liverpool, New York, where Stacey was now living, to come and have a drink with her mother, to come and talk it through. Ashley went home. She had a drink with her mother. She does not remember most of what happened next. What she remembers is fragments. A glass, pills in her hand, her mother's voice telling her to take them. More pills, more drinks. The world getting slow, the world getting strange, the world going dark. For the next 17 hours, while her daughter lay unconscious on a bed in the family home, Stacey Castor sat down at her home computer and began to type. She typed a suicide note, a 750-word suicide note, a note that she intended the police to believe had been written by her own daughter. In the note, Stacey, pretending to be Ashley, confessed to 2 murders. She confessed to killing Michael Wallace, her own father, when she was 11 years old. She confessed to killing David Castor, her stepfather, when she was 18. She rambled. She used no punctuation. She spelled the word antifreeze for separate times as antifree, without the letter Z, and when she was finished typing the note that would frame her own child for her own crimes, Stacey Castor folded a copy of it, placed it near her daughter's body, and waited for Ashley to die. Ashley Wallace did not die. Somewhere in those 17 hours, by an accident of biology that her mother had not counted on, the combination of vodka and prescription pills that should have killed 3 grown men failed to kill one 20-year-old girl. A family member found Ashley unconscious and called for an ambulance. The paramedics rushed her to the hospital. The doctors pumped her stomach. They put her on fluids. They worked on her for hours. And when she finally opened her eyes, weak and confused and barely able to speak, a grim-faced detective named Dominic Spinelli was sitting beside her bed, holding in his hand a piece of paper. He showed her the suicide note. He read parts of it aloud to her. He asked her if she had written it. Ashley, lying in that hospital bed, looked at the note and said the only thing she could think of to say. She said, "I did not write this. I did not do any of these things. I have no idea what they are talking about." But Detective Spinelli, looking at that note, had already seen something that he could not unsee. He had interviewed Stacey Castor weeks earlier. He had sat across a table from her and listened to her talk for hours. And during that interview, Stacey, in her own voice, had referred to the chemical that killed her husband more than once as antifreeze. Without the Z, he had thought it was strange at the time. He had not known what to make of it. And now here, in his hand, was a suicide note supposedly written by a 20-year-old college student. A suicide note 4 pages long, in which the word antifreeze appeared for separate times, and in every single instance, the writer had spelled it the same way. Stacey Castor had spelled it out loud, across the table in an interrogation room. Antifreeze, without the Z. It was the smallest possible detail. A single missing letter. A typo so small that, in any other context, no one would ever have noticed it. But in that hospital room, in that moment, in the hands of that detective, that single missing letter was the entire case. It was the thread that, when pulled, unraveled to years of careful, patient, cold-blooded planning. It was the thing Stacey Castor had not thought of, the thing she could not have thought of, because she did not know. As she sat at her home computer typing a fake suicide note in her own daughter's name, that her own way of saying the word out loud had already been written down in a detective's notebook. Investigators arrested Stacey Castor at the hospital. They charged her with the murder of David Castor. They charged her with the attempted murder of her own daughter. They charged her with forging her husband's will. And as they led her out of that hospital in handcuffs, Stacey Castor's face, according to the officers who were there, did not change. Not when they read her the charges. Not when they walked her past her own daughter's hospital room. Not when she heard the camera shutters of the reporters who had already begun to gather outside. Not once, not even a little. The trial began in January of 2009. For 4 weeks, in a courtroom in Syracuse, New York, the prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. The exhumation, the ethylene glycol, the forged will, the wiretap recording, on which Stacey could be heard discussing the suicide note while her daughter was at school, the misspelled word. And on the 14th of January, Ashley Wallace, 21 years old now, walked into that courtroom and took the witness stand. She testified about the night her mother had asked her to come home, about the drinks, about the pills, about waking up in the hospital, and being told that the woman who had raised her had tried to kill her. She wept on the stand. She did not look at her mother. Stacey Castor sat at the defense table throughout her daughter's entire testimony, with an expression that the reporters in the room would later describe as stone, motionless, empty, the face of a woman watching a movie she had already seen. The jury deliberated for 16 hours over 4 days. On the 5th of February, 2009, they returned with their verdict. Stacey Castor was guilty of the second-degree murder of David Castor. She was guilty of the attempted second-degree murder of her daughter Ashley Wallace. She was guilty of forging her late husband's will. There was a loud gasp from the front row of the courtroom, where Ashley sat with her younger sister, Bree, and the rest of the Wallace and Castor families. They held each other. They wept. Stacey did not move. On the 5th of March, 2009, Onondaga County Judge Joseph Fahey sentenced Stacey Castor to 51 1/3 years to life in a New York State prison. Before he handed down the sentence, the judge looked across his courtroom at the woman standing in front of him in handcuffs, and he said something that has been quoted in nearly every account of this case written since. He said that in 34 years in the criminal justice system, as a lawyer and a judge, he had seen serial killers, contract killers, killers of every variety and stripe. But he had to say, "Mrs. Castor, you are in a class all by yourself." Stacey Castor never confessed. She maintained, all the way through her trial, and all the way through her sentencing, and all the way through the appeals that followed, that she had not killed anyone, that her daughter had killed Michael Wallace at age 11, that her husband had killed himself, that she was the victim of a prosecution that had decided she was guilty before It had looked at the evidence. On the 11th of June, 2016, Stacey Castor was found dead in her cell at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in Westchester County, New York. She was 48 years old. The official cause of death was never publicly contested. She had served 7 years of her 51-year sentence. She would not be eligible for parole until she was nearly a century old. The judge who sentenced her had been right. She had died in prison, just as he had said she would. This is the story of a woman who, for almost a decade, hid in plain sight in a small town in central New York, who killed the father of her own children, who killed the man who had given her a home and a name and a future, who tried, when investigators got too close, to murder her own daughter and frame her for crimes she had spent 20 years committing, and who was caught, in the end, not by a single brilliant detective or a single dramatic confession, but by a single missing letter, in a fake note typed on a home computer, in a quiet house in Liverpool, New York. The letter Z, 3 strokes of a pen, the smallest possible piece of evidence in a case full of bodies and graves and exhumed coffins, the thing she did not think of, the thing that, in the end, was the only thing she needed to think of. So I will leave you with this. If a woman like Stacey Castor could live in an ordinary town, in an ordinary house, with an ordinary husband and 2 ordinary daughters, for almost 20 years, without a single neighbor or coworker or family member ever suspecting what she really was, if she could bury one husband under a false cause of death and walk free for 7 years before anyone thought to ask the right question, if she could come within a single misspelled word of framing her own child for her own murders, then how many women like Stacey Castor are out there right now? How many men have already died in beds in quiet houses in quiet towns, with grieving wives standing in the hallway, telling responding officers that their husbands had been depressed lately? How many graves have been closed too quickly? How many questions have not been asked? I do not know the answer to that. Neither did the detectives in Onondaga County. Neither did Judge Joseph Fahey. Neither, in the end, will you. But the next time you hear about a healthy man in his 30s or his 40s who died suddenly in his sleep, of what the doctors are calling, for now, a heart attack, I want you to remember the name Stacey Castor. And I want you to ask yourself, gently and quietly and without telling anyone, the one question that for 7 long years no one ever asked about Michael Wallace. What if it wasn't? If this story moved you, if it shook you, if it made you look at the people around you a little differently than you did this morning, tell me in the comments. Tell me where you were watching from. Tell me what you would have done if you had been Ashley Wallace, 20 years old, lying in a hospital bed, listening to a detective read a suicide note that was supposed to have been written in your own handwriting. And subscribe to this channel, because next week, I am going to tell you the story of a husband who told the police his wife had run off with another man in 1987. 34 years later, his own daughter found something in the basement freezer that proved he had been lying the entire time. You will not want to miss it.